This episode of the Briar Patch is brought to you by Audible.com, offering more than 180,000 titles for smartphone, tablet, and desktop. To get a free audiobook of your choice and help Trek FM at the same time, visit audibletrial.com/trekfm. And also by Enterprise in Space, an international program of the nonprofit National Space Society. Find out how you can help science and education and become a virtual crew member aboard the NSS Enterprise Orbiter by visiting enterpriseinspace.org. Want to join the conversation and share your thoughts on this episode? Join the Babel Conference, our listeners group on Facebook. Just type BABEL into the Facebook search field. We look forward to seeing you there.
This is Robert Picardo, the emergency medical hologram from Star Trek Voyager, and you're listening to Trek FM.
This is the 24th century. We've grown out of our infancy. People are no longer obsessed with the accumulation of things. We've eliminated hunger, want. Material needs no longer exist. The acquisition of wealth is no longer the driving force in our lives. Enjoy.
Today on the Briar Patch, we'd like to expand on a concept that you brought up in the last episode, which was evolution of society and culture.
Yeah. We're going to look at a few specific episodes that help explore this topic, which is actually a topic that I think a lot of Star Trek, of all the different Star Trek series, touch on.
Yeah, this seems to be something they go into in great deal. I mean, the Prime Directive is tied into how evolution or how societies should evolve technologically, sociology, culturally, how their societies should be run, if they should interfere with the way they dole out justice or whatnot. All these things kind of tie in to the main premise of Star Trek, in my opinion.
Yeah, exactly.
So one of the things that would prove this out is Hayek's evolution of spontaneous orders. Would you like to expand on that?
Yeah. So Hayek, Friedrich A. Hayek, who is one of the main Austrian school scholars of the modern Austrian school, has a concept that he calls it cultural evolution. And he talks about it as very much similar to natural evolution but he doesn't see it as Darwinian. So he says essentially that cultures evolve. And the reason that he wants to look at this in a sort of a theoretical light is because he says that otherwise you can't really explain, if there was no evolution of culture, if there were no forces that helped cultures evolve, then you couldn't actually explain how traditions and norms and things in modern society have come about. So I'll explain this a little bit more detail. So he says that successful practices get passed on through this process of cultural evolution, because he says that our instincts do not lead us to have the kinds of modern norms and practices and morality that we have, but also reason wouldn't necessarily bring us to the traditions and practices that we have today, because our instincts maybe are more connected to old-fashioned tribal societies. So we might have an instinct against outsiders. We might have an in-group instinct where we only care about people who are very much like us and would hate outsiders. And we have some of this still today, but we also have practices and norms and culture that is supposed to be more encompassing, where we accept people who are different from us. So how did this come about? And reason can't explain all of it either, because there are many traditions and norms that you wouldn't, if you were planning out society, you wouldn't necessarily choose these kinds of traditions and norms. They had to emerge from the society somehow. And so he was exploring how these came about. And he said essentially that groups that practiced these norms, or societies in which these norms did emerge, were more successful than other ones. So similar to, which is kind of a group selection or a group evolution, but still it's similar to Darwinian evolution in the sense that the ones that succeeded continued to expand, and societies that had other kinds of norms failed. There is a sense in which there's natural selection going on, but it's not really a Darwinian selection. It's kind of, it has more in common with Lamarckian evolution. It has more in common, because Lamarck spoke about group selection, but he also spoke about how you could, and this is not really considered true for biological evolution, but he said that you could teach your children something and then they could pass it along through genetically, which doesn't really work. And we mostly think that that's not how it works for biological evolution, but for social cultural evolution, that could be the case. You teach your kids something and that becomes part of the society that you're in, and then that society that you're in can pass that along. So it kind of does work in this social cultural evolution sense.
Right. Like, for instance, being an American, I love baseball more than football, where Europeans teach their children to play football first, so they kind of respect that more. It's a very basic setup, but it's the taught actions of what they care about that then funnel through the individual society that makes the societies actually different.
Right. And then if one of the societies succeeds because some of the norms that they have, then that society will persist and those norms will get passed along. And sort of if another society is almost born out of the society that succeeded, then some of those norms and practices will get passed along to that other society. So, for example, if a nation goes and expands into another country, the norms and practices of the mother nation will get passed along to the, offspring nation that, where they've colonized some new territory.
Right. Interestingly, though, I don't think it's really talked about in this theory. There are some traditions that are held over from older societies so that it's easier for the new society to fold in.
Yeah, I think that is part of this. Why do you think it's not part of this
because
theory?
This basically says if your society wins, then those societies' beliefs kind of go away. They didn't work well.
Oh, I see what you're saying.
But however, you would have certain religions, right, would become prominent in an area, and they would adopt the holidays of the other religions, the previous religions, so that there was kind of less pushback. So maybe it does fit in because what makes them successful in taking over the society is actually keeping some of those traditions, but it's right. Kind of not in the strict sense of the theory that would work that way.
Right. Yeah, and it's very interesting, and a lot of people think that this is one area where Hayek was wrong. So, there's a lot of debate about it, even among Austrians. And how much you should connect it to either Lamarckian or Darwinian evolution is open to question as well. But I find it interesting because it gives you a lens with which to look at it, even if you decide that the theory doesn't make sense. And I'm not sure about this competition between different societies and one society winning. I'm not entirely sure that that's the way things get transmitted, but I think the whole theory is an interesting lens with which to look at it. And then you can decide for yourself how things get passed along and whether it really has to do with one of them winning or not, or whether it simply has to do with you could still see other kinds of evolutionary or the spontaneous order that we talked about, especially, in the last episode, we talked about it a bit, the idea of emergence from the interaction between individuals, and then kind of seeing the way that traditions and norms and cultural ideas get passed along down the line, whether it has to do necessarily with a natural selection process or not is open to question, but you can still get something out of the theory in terms of the lens that you view society with. Yeah, if that makes any sense.
Yeah, and I think we can kind of put it, maybe not so much that it's the be-all, end-all theory or that it doesn't exist. I think, for me personally, I believe it's kind of what percentage do you think it plays in?
Right.
If two cultures end up in an area that has all snow, the one that wears heavy clothing is going to survive. The one that doesn't is not.
Right.
but there's a lot more that plays into why they make those choices. So it's not as spontaneous as he makes it out to be, and so it doesn't hold true 100% of the time. Maybe 10, maybe 20, maybe 30. That's for the listener to decide what they believe. But Yeah.
Right, but it's interesting, you mentioned wearing coats, and that is kind of a cultural thing, but also maybe the technology for producing those coats is a technological thing, and we'll see as we look at the Star Trek episodes that the two tie in a lot together. You have technology and you have the culture and the norms and the social practices, and they're very much tied in. Technology will inform your culture, and culture will allow you perhaps to be more likely to produce a new technology. So they're very well tied in.
Right, absolutely. And one great episode that allows us to look at that is the Voyager episode Blink of an Eye.
Yes, absolutely. So Blink of an Eye, if you remember, is when Voyager came upon a planet and they ended up getting stuck. I forget exactly why they got stuck, but they got stuck by this planet. Well, I guess it's kind of explained by the nature of the planet, which was that the planet was their timescale was incredibly fast, like in the blink of an eye. So they went from a very primitive, if you will, kind of culture and technology, to a very advanced one in a very short amount of time. And meanwhile, a very short amount of time for Voyager and I guess for the rest of the universe. So they had their own little bubble in which everything went super fast. And so it's a quite obvious one to begin with because it's an episode in which you can see the entire evolution culturally and socially of this society all in one episode.
Right. What I also find interesting is it also gives you an insight into how easily it is to manipulate's not the right word, but influence a society because they eventually get technology like telescopes and better telescopes, and they see Voyager and they believe it's a god that's actually helping them get through this. And when things go wrong, they believe, and they're right for the wrong reasons, that Voyager is causing the Earth to shake and terrible things to happen.
Right. And, as you point out, it's very easy for them to influence it. In fact, the fact that they built telescopes when they did is probably because they wanted to see what was this thing up in the sky. So it was encouraging their technological advancement, at least in the beginning. And they were even worried maybe if Voyager left, then they would stop having a reason to keep advancing their technology. Although they also decided maybe it would have the opposite effect. You never know. Maybe if Voyager left, then they would want to replace this, idea of Voyager with something new. Maybe Voyager was trapping them in this kind of idea of a religion, of Voyager being some type of god or something. And when they left, they would have to explore what was it that was there and then left. And, maybe that would help them advance in different ways.
Right. It's amazing how different the culture can end up by what to Voyager could only be a matter of minutes, but however was generations after generations on the planet itself, and just how much that changes.
Yeah, and you can imagine, even Voyager leaving from when they got their engines going to when they actually were out of sight was quite a long time in their history. And you saw at the end, the person who had come aboard Voyager back on the planet was now an old man. He had come to Voyager when he was young, and by the time they were leaving, he was an old man.
Right, absolutely. So is there anything more that you want to say? Go ahead.
Oh, sorry. Yeah, so I think the main reason that I wanted to bring that one up was just the idea of seeing the entire evolution in one episode. I think we could do our own entire episode on that one Voyager episode, but I don't know if we need to go into that much more detail on that at the moment, unless you have something else to say about it.
No, I believe that kind of covers the idea that we're trying to get across for that episode, and just how easily it is to change. I mean, it doesn't really go into the spontaneous order part of this theory, but it does show just how easily it is to change a society just by showing up and leaving.
Right. Obviously, in this case, it was easier to influence them because of the time differential, but that's something that is explored in many episodes of Star Trek anyway. Even if you don't have such a time differential, just leaving a piece of technology there, as you had in that Enterprise episode where it's called the tricorder or whatever. It was named after the piece of technology that they almost left behind. Yeah. So even just one thing like that can totally affect a society if, in that case, you don't have a time differential, but you have a technology differential. The Starfleet people were from the future in a sense, because it's almost like in time travel, you make one effect on the past and it could change everything. And in this case, it's not a time travel, but they're almost in a sense from the future of that society because they have technology that is hundreds of years more advanced, if you will.
Yeah, that's an absolute perfect segue into the next episode that would be discussed here, which is the next generation's Who Watches the Watchers, which is perfect because this is exactly what it talks about. They have an accident, so they get seen that they were watching a society. I don't remember the name of the society off the top of my head, but they were watching them. They have an accident. They get found out. Beverly Crusher decides to bring one of the injured up to the ship, and he accidentally wakes up and sees Picard. And Picard, he becomes obsessed with the idea that the Picard is the god that decides basically everything for them.
Right. So yeah, again, they've kind of become this religious figure to the society by accident. And there was another Starfleet admiral or whoever he was who says, oh, well, then just create a lovely religion for them around this idea. And then at least we'll have a positive influence on them instead of a negative one or something. And Picard says, no way. I'm not going to do that. I'm not going to become their god. And so he said, well, what else can we do? And Picard says, well, let's show them the man behind the curtain, essentially, let's show them the truth and see what happens. And they're a pre-Vulcan society, kind of, or an early Vulcan society in a sense, or a cousin of them. So they're very rational in many ways, and they had dropped religion. And this is a good example of when Star Trek seems to be anti-religion. Some people who are religious might look at it and say they're anti-religion because Picard says, well, they've gotten over the superstition and religion of the past. They're beyond that. So how could we help them bring that back in? Seeing it as a negative thing. But really, I think, the idea isn't that religion is bad, but it's that, if you use religion to answer things, then you're not using logic and rationality, and you're not going to have a very easy time kind of advancing both culturally and technologically because you keep looking to religion to answer everything.
Yeah, that may be true, but he actually calls it, I'm not going to send them back to the Dark Ages. He talks about superstition and fear, so there was definitely a hint of not wanting to put a religion on a culture anyway.
Certainly not wanting to put a religion on them, but he doesn't, you can see it as purely anti-religious, but you could also just see it as not wanting them to delay their cultural evolution and technological evolution by looking to religion to answer everything, because that's what they were doing. They were saying, oh, the Picard wants this, and the Picard does that.
Yeah, I think just the added Dark Ages part is what gives it that real anti-religion feel. Even if they didn't really necessarily mean that, it just sounds like they're saying that religion is the Dark Ages, that it doesn't count for enlightenment at all. Which I think even if we looked at our own societies, we would find that not to actually be completely true. There were actually many philosophers who were also clergy or,
absolutely.
So,
absolutely. And a lot of the, say, Adam Smith and a lot of those who came out of that classical economics, as I mentioned in an earlier episode, they wanted to get around having the clergy and the church as imposing the social order, but they also relied on sort of religion and religious practices and culture and norms to help guide the society. So a lot of them talk about the Protestant ethic and how that helps bring about a good market system, because people have to, for example, trust each other, and they have to actually do what they say and so forth. And they also have to have a work ethic, show up every day and not try to just get away with not doing work, shirking. And in a sense, also, if you have, government system, we talked before about how if something is publicly owned, you can have a tragedy of the commons, you can have people not taking care of things, not cleaning up after themselves if it's public property because you don't care about it. But if you have these good ethics, and you believe in caring for things, and you believe in caring for each other and all of that, Adam Smith would say these virtues will help bring about a better society. People, you don't have to do everything just out of self-interest. You also have these other virtues that can help keep the society in good order.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think as we see this episode go on, we find that the main, I can't remember his name, but the main character, the one who saw the Picard, he ends up becoming obsessed with the idea of the Picard and figuring out what the Picard wants. And I find one of the greatest lines in the show is when Troy says to him, the problem with doing what a superstition, she calls the Picard a superstition, but the problem with doing what a superstition wants is you never really know what they want. Because they believed that the Picard was sending down lightning simply because the other research member was taken by Riker back to the ship. And she helped allow this. So they must punish her for her mistakes or her transgressions.
Right. And this is what I was saying about if you use religion to answer questions, then you won't look for other answers using rationality and logic and so forth and science. So you won't investigate things, find out why something really happened, and build on that knowledge and evolve, as a society, as a culture, and technologically, if you kind of say, oh, well, this is why it happened. It was the Picard. And now and you'll even have wrong answers. You say, oh, the lightning was caused by Picard. Instead of learning about nature and what lightning is and so forth, you just say, oh, it's the Picard getting angry. And you also say, well, this means that we have to do X, Y, and Z in order to make the Picard happy. And so it can take you on this totally wrong route where you're following a line of reasoning that doesn't actually have any true basis.
Right, absolutely. And I find it interesting that Picard's answer to this, like you said, was to show them the magic. So he brings up Merlina, I think her name was Merlina.
I don't remember.
Muriel and Liko. Okay. So what I find interesting is that Picard's answer to this was to show them the magic. And the way he was going to do that is he was going to bring one member of their society up, the one he believed he had the best chance of explaining this to, which was Muriel. So he's going to bring her up, and she comes up, and she says, she bows to him. He says, no. She says, you don't want me to. He goes, I don't deserve it. Then when they walk towards the door's open, and she goes, even the walls beckon to your command, or something along those lines. And that's when he decides he's going to explain to her, no, before you lived in huts, where did you live? And she says, well, our ancestors, we believe, lived in caves because we found tools there. She goes, so they didn't have bows. What would they think of your bows? They'd think it was magic. And you think she's getting it. And she's not at all. She doesn't understand it at all. He doesn't get through to her there. He has to actually take her because she then asks him to bring back 4 children and 2 adults who died in the floods a year earlier. He has to bring her to see someone die on the ship.
Yeah, I think she was getting it somewhat, but she still believed that because even though it was technology that had advanced, she thought maybe it had still had advanced to such a degree that he could also bring people back from the dead, I mean, I think she still somewhat got it, and that's why when she then saw the limitation, that helped her fully understand. Yeah, well,
that's when she finally makes the assertion that, oh, you may be technologically advanced, but you're really no better than we are. After she sees the man die, that's when they go down to the planet, and I find it interesting that, Picard actually challenges Liko. So I now remember his name, Liko. Liko's belief that Picard is a god, and it actually makes him more obsessed with the idea that he's a god. To prove it to the point where he's going to shoot an arrow at Picard to prove he's not just a man, that he's a god.
Yeah, which was, I thought, a little bit ironic because, he was saying, okay, shoot me, kill me if you think, if you want to, but you'll see that I'll just die like anyone else, but then he doesn't die. Well, because they have better medical care.
True, but he also only gets hit in the shoulder because the daughter hits him as he goes to shoot. He doesn't hit him in the chest. I mean, he hits him high in the shoulder, which is fine. So they do kind of give an answer for that, but
Oh, sure, they give an answer. I just think it's funny. I think it's a little ironic that that's the way that he's going to prove it, but then he does kind of, in a sense, have the power to not die.
Right, yeah, really just more of the fact that they saw blood is...
Yeah, that's true.
He's mortal. I'm bleeding. If I don't get help, I'm going to die. And you caused this because you believed that I was something I'm not. Now can we move on from here, because I'm clearly not. But how does that... See, for our listeners, how does that tie back to the spontaneous order that's involved?
Okay. Well, so at, the conversation that you described where he says, first you had bows and arrows and then you had huts and then you had, or whatever the order was. It's a description of this evolution of society, and it wasn't, you didn't have a god reaching in and giving them technology. You didn't have even a smart dictator who planned out how you were going to go from this to this to this. Instead, what you had was learning from mistakes, interacting. You had comparative advantage. Some people were better at something, someone else was better at something else, division of labor, and all of these things. And slowly you developed more and better technology over time. And you also, in Hayek's case with the cultural evolution, he argues, you also had perhaps different groups with different norms, and the ones with the norms that worked better, those were retained because they succeeded better than another group that had norms that said you can steal from each other, or you can do that. In a sense, like government evolves out of everyone realizing that we don't want people stealing from each other. So let's have an arbitrator or a police that can stop people from stealing from each other. And the society that does that succeeds better than the society that says, oh, don't worry about it. We can all steal from each other. It's okay. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that makes perfect sense. I just wanted the listeners to understand, because we went on kind of a tangent on God, which doesn't really necessarily play into this particular episode of our podcast.
Not entirely, but it does. There is something important about, for cultural evolution, I think, from Star Trek's perspective. I think there is something important in saying a society will evolve better if they don't assume that God is in charge, and that there is the idea of cultural evolution and spontaneous order is also that there doesn't have to be one person that makes these decisions, whether it's God or whether it's a planner or, a single government or dictator who's deciding how things should evolve over the decades and centuries and so on.
Right. No, absolutely. And you have, even if you take it even simpler than your explanation, they moved out of caves into huts. The huts that stood up, they built more like that. The huts that fell down, they stopped building those.
Exactly.
So it can be that simple, and then you can extrapolate that farther and farther into other parts of the culture that would survive that way.
Yeah, exactly. And that's exactly what we're talking about in terms of cultural and technological evolution. And there's one other thing about the God thing, which is that they believed because the Starfleet people were so much more advanced than they were. That's why they thought they must be gods. And it also, you can connect this to, say, Q, who you could look at, you could say, oh, Q is a god, but in a sense, he might just be a much more advanced society. You have aliens that say, we once were like you and we had bodies. Like you have the incorporeal ones, maybe in TOS, in the original series, but also in Enterprise, you have a species like that. So you could imagine also this other idea of evolving, it's almost tied in with the biological evolution of a species. It might be that over a long period, you evolve biologically as well, and as a society, to a place where you no longer need bodies. Maybe because you put yourself into robots through technology, or maybe it's a biological evolution where you actually no longer require your bodies and you kind of rise above them. And that looks very spiritual, but there could be a scientific explanation for that. And I think that's what Star Trek kind of looks at, is maybe there's a scientific explanation to everything, even God.
Right. The only series that really doesn't do that is DS9. Because DS9 lets you kind of...
They have wormhole aliens.
Correct, and they call them that forever, and by the end, you kind of feel like they still believe they're
Well,
God.
the Bajorans might.
That they're not
The
just
Bajorans
aliens.
might.
Well, even Cisco does.
Yeah.
Because in the beginning, he's very against it. By the end, he believes he is the what are they
The emissary. But he may be an emissary. An emissary is also a cultural, social, kind of a societal thing. You can be an emissary that brings the ideas of one society to another society, almost like a diplomat, right?
You can, but I don't get the feeling at all that he doesn't believe that they're God.
Well, prophets, they don't call them God. Well, I guess they kind of call them gods. Well, that's maybe a debate for another day.
Yeah, no, I'm just pointing out that it seems like every other episode kind of just wants to stay away from religion, and that one wholeheartedly, it's really the only one that embraces religion as not necessarily being a negative on what they're trying to show, at least. Whether they believe religion itself is negative or not is another story, but it's not a negative on what they're trying to show within these episodes.
Sure. But yeah, let's put that to the side maybe. But it is an interesting question. I think we should probably come back to religion because religion is connected to the social sciences. Absolutely, because it's been so much of a part of the history of so many cultures that it is something that we should look at in the future.
Absolutely. I absolutely agree.
So
we can move on to say...
Yeah, so the next thing that I want to talk about is a little bit, is something that's connected to the idea of cultural and social evolution, which is the idea of enlightenment. And we have the Enlightenment from our history, but we also have an idea of enlightenment of the mind or of the people from, for example, Lenin and Marx, and the socialists' idea of a new man and of overcoming the sort of greed and negative attributes that you might say have been carried along through cultural evolution because they were able to be part of, say, markets. So you had Adam Smith talking about virtues, but you also had him talking with his idea of the invisible hand of how things that might not be considered a virtue, like selfishness, self-interest, can be channeled to bring about a good society through the market because you seek profit and you compete and trying to gain more profit and therefore you serve the customer better and so forth. And you had Marx and the socialists saying that in socialism, you wouldn't need to channel greed because people would overcome these ideas of greed and so forth. So you have this idea of kind of enlightenment of the individual and of society, and we can look at the way that this is connected to cultural evolution because if it's being channeled to the good, then maybe you're not ever overcoming those cultural and social norms. So you're never getting rid of greediness if you're channeling it, if it's being used to good effect, because then the cultures that channel greed but still have greed are going to succeed better than those that don't make use of the greed, or also that don't even have the greed. Because if they don't have the greed, they're not going to make as many new gadgets and stuff if they also have a market system. So assuming that you keep the market system, maybe the more greedy societies are going to do better than the other ones. So how do you actually evolve past greed if you retain the market society and the greedier ones are more successful? So I'm going to raise that, and then I want to talk about the way that workforce connects to this idea of enlightenment of the mind. But I want you to respond to that. Does that make sense, what I said?
No, the theories make sense. I just don't know necessarily, because you'd have really more than one force at play.
Sure.
When you talk about socialism, because, yes, the society itself doesn't have greed, but much like we see in Star Trek, the Federation doesn't have a sense of money. But they still have to trade with Ferengi and Klingons and others. So there's still something being used as a market, even though there's not really a market within the Federation.
I want to jump
itself.
in there, though, and say that although they didn't do much trade with capitalist societies, there was in totally non-market societies like the Soviet Union, they would still have to do some trade with the outside world, and they could connect that, and they could use plans to arrange how much they were going to do that, and they could use money or just trade to trade with other societies, but that didn't affect the internal society very much.
No, I understand, but that's what I mean. So maybe I'm just misinterpreting your question, but if I wanted to have a socialist society and you wanted to keep your markets, I could still set up my socialist society if I had enough people to do that, and still coexist with your society as long as we weren't fighting over the same land.
Okay, and then the competition between the two societies would probably be more on the basis of the difference in the way that we set up our society rather than in the difference of who had more greed. But the idea I think that I was talking about is that if you had a market system all the way up until when you decided to bring in your socialist system, there would have been nothing to stop you from still being as greedy as you were before. Because if greed was helping you when you were a market system, then you're not going to overcome that greed in time to bring in the socialist society, if you get what I'm saying.
Right, no, I do understand. And I think that kind of works both ways, though. I think you can look at some social societies, and while they weren't great, they weren't perfect, the Soviet Union was doing fairly well for itself. It started to falter, and then when it flipped over the way it did too suddenly, it crashed horribly. So there's kind of a give and take there. It doesn't just work one way. I think it works kind of both.
I mean, in terms of competing with other societies, in a sense, the Soviet Union was kind of doing fine competing, which, again, this is one of the things people talk about when they talk about why Hayek's idea of cultural evolution may not work very well in terms of the competition between societies. But you have to remember, I mean, in terms of doing well, I think it did not achieve what it was trying to achieve at all. So I think it failed in that sense. But in terms of competing with other societies, you're right. I mean, it was doing pretty well. It was competing in the space race and so on, but that was kind of at the expense of the people and at the expense of the free and open society that they had been hoping for and so on. But in terms of competing with other societies, it was successful, which is why I think a lot of people have some problem with this idea of the competition between societies that Hayek talks about.
Yeah, well, we're back to the gradation. How much percentage do you put into each theory? You know, because like you said, the socialism really took a toll on the freedoms of people. There's some argument that a completely free society does sort of the same thing, in that workers over many years, many generations, were taken advantage of because they just had nowhere else to go to work. So there has to be something on either end. There has to be some kind of oversight. The only difference, in my opinion, is that under a free market society, it's much easier to set up checks and balances than there is in a communist society where there's much fewer people handling what the checks and balances might be.
Sure, and there's a lot more that you have to keep checks and balances on, in a sense, in a planned society. Because in a free market society, competition does do a lot of the work for you. So there's less that you have to keep an eye on, in a sense. And you can have, hopefully, simple rule of law take care of most of it, and then only need specific regulations that take care of individual cases less often. Whereas in a socialist society, you have just so many things that are being planned out, and you have to keep an eye on each of them and make sure every single thing is working well. So that's why you end up with a lot more bureaucracy, or that's one reason. Anyway, I want to bring us back to this idea of the enlightenment of the people. And the way that this sort of theoretically ties in, as I mentioned, I think you have like whether greed and other attributes of the individual, cultural attributes and such, and the way that people act get passed along. So in the episode Workforce, if you remember, this is the one where they lost their memories. And they believed that they were just working in this, basically they were just working like you would in a capitalist society, working for their money and living. Maybe it wasn't capitalist. They don't really talk about that very much, or at all maybe. But in any case, they were no longer Starfleet. They were working for a living. And so I think the interesting thing that this raises in the context of what we're talking about today is the way that our memories, our beliefs about ourselves, our past, all of that affects our choices in life and the way that we interact in the society. So because they remembered what they were, told, what they were made to remember, and they had the beliefs that they thought about themselves, they made the choices that they made in that episode. And Janeway, found someone that she fell in love with, and she loved her job, she thought, and she moved in with the guy, and she was making these choices, and that was purely based on the fact that she had these certain memories. As soon as she remembered that she was actually the captain of a starship, she wanted to do that. So we have we're kind of stuck in the life that we're in because of the memories that we have and the notions that we have about our own life. So I don't know, it informs this idea of cultural evolution in a way, because we're stuck in this, we're making these choices because of, they call it path dependency, in economics and in the social sciences. So because of this path dependency, meaning the way that my past has led up to my present, and the way that the culture's history in the past has led up to where it is today, because of this kind of path dependency, including in the individual, your own memories and your own ideas, that informs the choices that you're going to make. And that kind of ties the culture into a certain, it kind of roots it, but it also prevents it from just going and doing, it won't just suddenly change into something new. It's going to slowly evolve. And that's part of this evolution. Does that make sense?
Absolutely. We see this all the time, in the world that we live in. You see that things that happen, for instance, America, a lot of the reasons why people have some political stances or beliefs is because of what founding fathers did, before and after the revolution, how that came about, how that was resolved. And that has informed how they believe things should be done now. You can talk about, and I don't want to get deep into it. I don't want to tell anyone how they should or shouldn't live their lives. But if you look at gun ownership rights, that's very much informed by the reasons that the founding fathers believed they were being oppressed by a government, and the only way to keep the government from oppressing them was to be able to own weapons so they could defend themselves.
That's exactly right, yeah.
We've come a long way years-wise. It's been a long time, and that's still absolutely the definitive reason for many of the people's stances. Now, there are other people in the country who oppose that view. They think because the weapons have changed, this, that, or the other thing, that the policy needs to change, and society has changed, and cultures have changed, and the rest of the world outlaws them differently or doesn't outlaw them differently. And maybe we should reevaluate that, but it's still, in this country anyway, it's still the majority that believes you should just be able to own
That's a great example, because, as you point out, it's the history, it's the founding fathers and this history and the culture from then and the ideas from then that inform the culture of today, that allows so many people to believe that. There are maybe other arguments. People can say that you're better off being able to defend yourself or something like that. But it seems like a lot of times those arguments are because people want to defend the idea that they can have guns, but they already wanted to have guns for this more cultural reason, something that they've inherited from the culture of the past. Maybe they love the idea of the founding fathers and the culture of America, and so that kind of informs their desire or their belief that people should be able to have guns, and then they kind of maybe justify it through other arguments, it seems like. At least a lot of those people. Right. And it's a great example of how the history informs the culture of today, and how that could also affect whether we're becoming more enlightened, whether our individual ideas about ourselves and our culture are able to evolve in the way that otherwise they might. They're being informed by the past. So it's a great example.
Right. And I wonder, I don't really know the answer. I don't know what gun ownership in England was before the revolution. I know there's not a lot of gun ownership.
There certainly isn't today. It's a good question.
Right, but when did that change? Because if that changed, let's just say that was the case back then, for argument's sake here, that would be a drastic change in culture when people came to this country and first founded it.
Right. I think it was, it was a frontier America, and they had to fight the revolution and all of that. And so I think the gun ownership happened in America, as it did in Australia, became part of the culture kind of when the country was founded more. I don't think individual gun ownership in England was ever what it was, at the founding of America in America.
Right. But my point is it's just amazing because that kind of flies in the face of this whole cultural belief that because of the past, something shocking enough can actually disrupt that whole system very, very quickly. They can go from not really, I don't know if they didn't believe in owning guns or they just didn't care about them, to believing that everyone should be able to own a gun and be in a militia, and it happened in a very, very
It
short
did, but
period
it
of
happened
time.
because a group of people went to a whole, like, all the way across the world. I mean, for them at the time, you know, I mean, it was not like you could take airplanes back and forth at the time. So it was a huge move. These people went and they founded a new culture and a new society. And of course, they retained a lot of the culture of what they had in England, but they also created a new culture because they were in a new place under new conditions. They were founding a colony, but they were doing it in a part of the world. They were interacting with another culture, the Native Americans, on a regular basis and getting into little battles and wars with them. And, you know, so there was a whole lot that was different in living in this new world. New world, they called it, you know?
You know, it's
like
a
new
massive
planet.
shock to the system. You know, it's a massive shock to the system, but it's just interesting how fast it can change given the right
Sure,
parameters.
but I mean, it also might have been over many decades that it became part of the culture because they wanted to defend themselves against Indians, they wanted to defend themselves against raiders, you know, and all of these things. And so they started to say, it's my right, because I have to defend myself against all of these new things that didn't exist in England.
Absolutely, absolutely. Two other episodes that do show that, the enlightenment of mind that we should probably touch on is Samaritan Snare and Tapestry.
Yeah. So Samaritan Snare, one of the things that first jumps out at me on this whole cultural evolution thing is that, so in that episode they're called the pack lads, right? And in that episode, they tried to jump ahead, in terms of culture, in terms of technology. So basically, there are these aliens who, they seem really stupid. And they end up kidnapping Geordi. That's the main thing that happens in the episode. The conflict, the excitement in the episode is about how they ask Geordi to help and then they try to keep him. And they want him because of his skills. And they keep doing this. That's basically how they're not as stupid as they seem in a sense. Cause they do all these plans, but it's like their whole culture is about how they can steal technology and skip over kind of the normal process of development that a culture normally goes through in technological advancement by stealing technology. So yeah, they've kind of, and that has sort of kept them stupid in a sense. So they haven't kind of evolved as they would. So in terms of enlightenment, in terms of what we call the Enlightenment in our past, partly because we got over some of our superstitions, and we started to develop more philosophically, and there are many reasons. And so they've kind of skipped over this by stealing technology. So they kind of never culturally and individually became more enlightened, if you see what I mean.
Right, absolutely. If I were to if I had no access to computers or technology or anything and I just stole a computer, I might get it to turn on and I might be able to do a few little things, but I wouldn't ever be able to really use it. I would never be able to fix it, and that's why they need Geordi, is because they have a problem fixing things. They never really learned the basics of the technologies. They just kind of stole it and moved on and tried to find better technology and then stole it and so on and so forth. But so yeah, they're just, like you said, they're skipping steps constantly, which is actually making them slower to evolve than they would have if they would have went through the natural progression, because they're still, if they were to create something, they'd still be way back behind the times.
Right. And it's interesting. You can see it. You can see the sort of cultural evolution aspect, because individually, I don't know how a computer works. I mean, I know how a computer works in a sense. I'm actually a programmer. I know certain things about it, but I couldn't build one from scratch. Right. And there's a lot of things that I couldn't build from scratch, but that I use every day. But as a culture, we know how these things work. There are other people within our culture that know how these things work. And because we haven't stolen the technology from an alien planet and stuck it on here, there's a knowledge within the culture that gets passed around. And in part, it means that we each individually might know more about it, but there's something else going on at a sort of social level that have allowed, because we haven't stolen it, we as a society are learning. And so, as you say, they've become slower, they learn less well, and so on. There's something that has been passed around through the culture because they keep trying to skip these steps and stealing things. right? So there's something at a social level going on here.
Right, absolutely. It's about, the social level of the learning. If we still had people who were trying to build buildings on their own, design a building and build a building, we wouldn't have very big buildings. We wouldn't have very strong buildings, But the fact that everyone is now specialized, the architect who draws up the prints, the guy who orders the material, the guy who installs the electric or the furnace or installs the AC ductwork or the drywall or the ceiling, they're all very specialized, and they're very much better at doing their job than one guy who tries to do the whole job. Because they have a lot more experience in what they do. And,
yeah, absolutely. There's a little story called I Pencil, which Austrians love to share around, which is about essentially nobody can make a pencil on their own. Not really. Not to the quality that you can buy a pencil at for like 5 cents in the shop. But there are a million different people, or maybe not a million, but there are loads of different people involved in making that pencil. And there are people at a factory in China working on this, and there are people hammering out the bit of metal that goes around the top of the pencil, and there are people chopping down the trees, and they're all part of this spontaneous order. They're part of this, and they trade with each other, and one person gets an input from here, adds to it, sells it, the next person buys that, and so on and so forth. And one person doesn't even know all the steps, but it emerges. And because people are trading, because people are specializing, you end up with things that no one person could do.
Right. And in theory, everyone is better off at the end because of it, because everyone, if you just want to look strictly economically speaking, but everyone ends up getting a paycheck out of that, not one person making a bad pencil, getting a little bit of money. More people get a share, and there's a lot more pencils out there.
Exactly.
But, and that's also shown.
I was going to say, and there's something that happens when a society cooperates in this way, and everyone is made better off, and the knowledge is distributed. But there's a way in which the society is enriched by this, and I think that's something that is there's something even more than what we're naming. I think that comes out of that ends up affecting the knowledge that exists within the society and the way that people emerge as more enlightened by this knowledge existing and being shared throughout the society. And because you gain knowledge from talking to someone else who has that other piece of knowledge, and there's something that is percolating through the society, this knowledge, this enlightenment that ends up adding to the culture. And that's what they're skipping in Samaritan Snare, these Pakleds, that they're kind of skipping over that. So their society is never enriched. There are no people in the society that have this knowledge to pass along.
Right. They always have to rely on stealing something else or taking someone hostage in order to get to the next step. But it's not their step. It's my step or your step that got them there. So they never really move forward as a race, so to speak.
Right.
And I think that's shown in the other episode we mentioned was Tapestry.
Yeah. In Tapestry, this is more of an individual level than a cultural level, but I still think it's important. In this episode, Picard, basically, he's regretting what he did when he was younger, the fact that he was an angry kind of he was taking risks, he was being silly, he was doing stupid things when he, in his youth, and he was regretting it. He was looking back on it, and Q gave him a chance to do it differently. And so he tried to do it differently, and he refused to stand up for his friends even because it was going to involve violence, and it was going to be against a stronger and multiple people. And that was when he got stabbed through the heart. And so he avoided it this time. And by doing that, the entire tapestry of his life changed, and he never ended up becoming captain. And so I think this is interesting because at the individual level, we make mistakes and we do things and we learn from our mistakes, but we also are affected by what happens, and our friends are affected and our choices are affected. And it does percolate through the society, but it's also each individual as I mentioned, path dependency before, what you do earlier in life affects what happens later in life and the choices that you make later in life, and your entire tapestry of your life can change. And I think this is also important when you're looking at cultural evolution at a social level, because you have to remember that each individual person has their own evolution throughout their own life, and also has path dependency, and also has all of these different things affecting them, and is shaped by their parents, and in turn then shapes the people that they interact with. And when you realize the high level of complexity that exists even at an individual level, then you realize how many forces there are within society, and how complex it is within society, that our evolution, that what emerges out of it, and the way that culture evolves, it involves so many layers of complexity. Almost, you can think of it as like fractals, each individual level is very complex and then affects the next level up, which affects the next level up. And it's this whole kind of fractal layer of complexity.
Well, if we just take Picard as an example, right? So he never gets stabbed. He never becomes captain. So now, if you want to look at that on a societal level, Farpoint never happens, maybe. Maybe whoever the captain there is doesn't care that they have a species as a base. Data never gets his freedom because the captain doesn't care and forces him to just go.
Right. Q said it wouldn't affect that many things, but I think ultimately it would have affected a lot of things. And it's almost, again, like time travel. The time travel episodes also touch on some of these same ideas, because if you go back in time and you change one thing, it's like the butterfly effect and all of that.
Yeah, I think it's very weak to say that it might not, for Q to say that it wouldn't affect many things. If Picard doesn't become captain, he doesn't become Locutus of Borg. If he doesn't become Locutus of Borg, they don't know how to defeat the Borg. That right there would change everything, because eventually the Earth would be the Borg. So, I mean, it's kind of nonsense.
I think Q
would even make that assertion.
I think Q only says it because he knows that Picard isn't going to want to stick with the new thing, and he's going to change it back anyway. So,
right, that may be true. I mean, I could rattle off time and time again that okay, so maybe the new captain does save Data, but that's not necessarily true. That doesn't have to be the case. Maybe the new captain gets taken by the Borg. That doesn't have to be the case. What I do know is not all of them would happen, because someone else would not put themselves in the exact same positions that Picard had put himself in. So society as we know it, pick a star date after Picard is captain, would not be identical.
Absolutely.
So do you have any final thoughts on the evolution of society and culture?
Well, I just think it's a really a rich topic that is explored in Star Trek. I think there's so many. I think we only touched on a few episodes that discuss this topic, and I think you can see it from a lot of different perspectives, through, the lens of, I think Hayek's cultural evolution is a great lens to look at it through, and so is Star Trek. And I think there are so many episodes that touch upon different aspects of this, and it's a rich topic that Star Trek richly explores. How about you, Patrick? Do you have any final thoughts?
I find this to be an interesting topic for us. It's also, we did it here now in one way, where we did the evolution of society and culture through Hayek's views. But I also did another episode when I guested on Metatrex, where we did the evolution of culture from a more general societal standpoint and a philosophical standpoint. And the episodes really, I think, would go well together, because they do have very varying views, where this is much more focused on one person's belief, or with a little bit of socialism thrown in. That one didn't look so much at that. It just really went into whether society is moving forward or backwards, or if it can move forwards and backwards, or even if forwards is not always forwards, and what would seem to be leaps backwards may in fact be forwards. I know that's a lot of forwards and backwards I just said, but my point is that they took different views, but I think they complement each other well, because they do look at it in such different ways.
Yeah, you bring up a really interesting point. I think also, by the way, primitive culture also might look at this topic. But you mentioned forwards and backwards, and that's not something that we really discussed in this episode, but is a really good question. I think the way that Hayek looks at it, because it's using this lens of evolution, whether it's Lamarckian or Darwinian, this idea of evolution and of winning out, it kind of answers the question of whether you're going forwards or backwards by saying whoever wins. And so that is, you're evolving. You might say about human evolution or evolution on the planet Earth, biologically, that it's not necessarily forward. It's just you're evolving. But, because you have survival of the fittest, in a sense, you can call that moving forward. But it's not, you don't necessarily have a value judgment on that. But you do have, I suppose, a survival value judgment. You're better at surviving. And so, again, if Hayek is right about this idea of cultural evolution and the selection by, groups competing, which again, we're not necessarily endorsing here, but if you do use that lens and you do believe that, then in a sense, you have an answer to the forward-backward question by saying, well, cultures that are better at surviving are, that we're moving more towards cultures that are, towards a culture that is better at surviving. Of course, if the way that a culture survives is by invading other cultures and expanding and so forth, then it wouldn't be necessarily a moral value judgment on that, but it would be still an evolutionary value judgment that they're better at surviving. But I think what's great about Star Trek is it doesn't say that, and I don't think that cultures on Earth that, where cultures that have invaded brutally have survived better. If you look at the Roman Empire, which survived for so long, they were expansive and they were certainly not perfect, but maybe compared to some other societies at the time, they were actually a bit less violent in their expansion. And they lasted a long time, say. So we could have a whole nother conversation about the history and whether it's, peaceful societies or violent societies have been better at surviving. But I think Star Trek takes the view, I think, that the more that you are culturally evolving, and in a sense, the less violent that you're becoming. And whether that's by choice or not, I mean, I think that Star Trek does kind of believe that there is an evolution going on there, that it's not a rational person saying, okay, in the next 500 years, let's be less violent and I'm going to plan this out and this is how it's going to happen. It's something that slowly evolves over time, right?
Right, absolutely. I mean, even the very first episode of Next Generation, the Q comes and says to them, well, you've been violent forever, and Picard's, please basically judge us for who we are today, not who we were 500 years ago, or back in the time of the World War III and whatnot. But to my point is, my real final thoughts on this is really that while we can look at this from these points of views and we can either believe or not believe what Hayek had to say about cultural and societal evolution, I don't think it's a hard fast. It doesn't exist, but it's also definitely not 100% true. There are many other forces that play into these, into how a society evolves than just simply, well, they did better at this, so we're all going to do this now, or we died out. Because not everything works perfectly everywhere, and you may find that what was working for you, you were doing really well, and you were getting a lot better, and then you moved, or water ran dry, and now you moved, and those same exact things are no longer working, and you don't have enough time to learn.
Absolutely. If I might jump in here, Hayek mentions that, or he talks a lot about local knowledge and things that are true at a local level in all of his theories, not just in this idea of cultural evolution. But it is something that is important because in a market system, each person is specialized and they have their local tacit knowledge. And again, in cultural evolution, you have things that work for a specific society living in a specific place at a specific time. And so it might win out and those norms might get passed along, but they might get passed along to the next society, which is not in the same place. And so then you have to deal with those historical artifacts and that path dependency and the, individual things that got passed along. So this is something I think that Hayek is aware of because he's aware of this local knowledge stuff. But it does, some people argue, I think, that it does undermine some of the idea of cultural evolution, or at least not that it exists, but that it works very well as well. I mean, this might explain why things don't always evolve as fast or as nicely or as cleanly as we would want.
Right, absolutely.
All right. Well, wow. It's been a lot of fun talking about Hayek's cultural evolution and Star Trek, but this is not all we've been talking about on the network this week. So here's a look at some of the other things going on Trek FM.
Previously on Trek.fm, Standard Orbit.
Fan consensus has sort of said, look, third season is terrible and awful and woeful, and a lot of it is. But you go back and you watch it, and there's a lot of it that carries over. Like, there's a lot of stuff that is, I think of like as quintessentially Star Trek. That sort of you see develop over the course of the third season.
The 602 Club.
There was a lot of screaming involved. I'll start with... You know what I'm talking about.
Snowball! 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 Yes. No, I know what you mean.
No,
I did
a lot
it too.
of... Oh my god! It's a Demogorgon!
Warp 5.
He had to learn to not interfere, and it's painful, and that's what makes it such a powerful episode, so this is definitely a see it. Okay, next.
All right, sleeping dogs. While exploring a gas...
Skip it.
Okay. All right, so Shadows of I think we already know what this one is.
keep going with the sleeping dogs.
The Edge, a Star Trek Discovery podcast.
It's like when Tyler was, explaining the situation and seeing it, and he was explaining it to Tyler, it's like he was almost apologizing for it. Like, I had to do this to save my life, and I'm still alive because I did this. But is he suffering guilt for that?
And that's what else is happening on Trek.fm.
Check out all those shows and join the conversation about your favorite corner of the Star Trek universe and beyond. You'll find us wherever you get your podcasts. If you're an Apple user, be sure to hit the subscribe button in Apple Podcasts on iPhone, iPad, or Apple TV, or the desktop iTunes app to get the latest episodes as soon as they're published. And please leave us a star rating and a written review. If you're not an Apple user, we've got you covered too. You can find our shows on Google Play Music, Stitcher, TuneIn, Spreaker, SoundCloud, Windows Phone, and in most third-party apps. And you can stream and download the MP3 directly from the website or grab the RSS link. So we'd love to hear your thoughts on today's show, and there's a great many ways for you to do that. The best place to join in the larger conversation is the Babel Conference, our listeners group on Facebook. Just type BABEL into the search field on Facebook, and it should come right up. If you'd like to send us an email, you can use the form on our website at trek.fm/contact, choose message to a Trek FM show, and select the Briar Patch. That'll come right to us. You can also find the network on Twitter at TrekFM and on Facebook at facebook.com/TrekFM. So, Patrick, when you're not looking at Hayek's cultural evolution through Star Trek, where can listeners find you?
Listeners can always find me on the Babel Conference. I'm always hanging out there, meeting and chatting with other people. I may not respond to everything you send my way, but if you tag me, I'll definitely make sure to do that. Or if you want to check me out on Twitter, it's MagicDrop5. It's one word. The 5 is a number, not letters. And Guinevere, when you're not looking for another culture to throw your computers at, where can people find you?
Yeah, well, I'm on Facebook a lot too. I'm often at the Babel Conference, but I'm also just posting all the time about all kinds of random stuff. I love to share links about all the latest economic stuff that I'm reading about. So you can just find me there. My name is spelled Guinevere, Guinevere, Nell, Nell. So look for me there and get in touch if you want. Well, if our listeners would like to help us keep all of these shows coming to you each week at Trek FM, you can become a patron of the network on Patreon. Visit patreon.com/TrekFM. That's patreon.com/TrekFM to get all the details. Perks include early access to episodes, exclusive content, producer credits, and more available through our special patrons website, Patron Zone. It does require a great deal of money to produce, host, and distribute these shows each month, so we really appreciate any support you can give us and hope you'll join the team. Again, you'll find all the details at patreon.com/TrekFM. And we'd like to take a moment to acknowledge the rest of the Briar Patch team from the network, specifically C. Brian Jones, founder and publisher of Trek FM, executive producers Matthew Rushing and Ken Tripp, Aaron Harvey, our art director, Richard Marquez, the production manager, and the Patreon manager, Brandon Shea Mutala. And don't forget to check out Enterprise in Space, a project of the nonprofit National Space Society. Visit enterpriseinspace.org to find out more and get your seat on the mission. And check out audible.com, offering more than 180,000 titles for your desktop or mobile device. To get a free audiobook of your choice, visit audibletrial.com/trekfm.
Well, we must be heading back into the Briar Patch now. Takes about a day for us to get to a place where we can transmit. Till next time, this is Guinevere and Patrick signing out.